Hello, we're talking to Jess Carniel, who is contributing to our special issue on the Eurovision Song Contest in an article entitled Skirting the Issue, Finding Queer and Geopolitical Belonging at the Eurovision Song Contest. How do geopolitics and queer identity meet at the Eurovision Song Contest? How does that work?
Well, I think that in terms of the Eurovision Song Contest, it's been a really important site as a subculture for a lot of LGBTI communities within Europe itself. As we all like to say, that Eurovision did come out in 1998 with Dana International, but even before then, there was a bit of an appeal to Eurovision that's just become more and more overt recently. And then what we've also noticed in recent years is a politicisation of the performances, which can be exemplified in someone like Conchita Wurst, who, even though her song is not political or anything like that, the very fact that she is a bearded drag queen up on the stage immediately puts queer identities onto the table as something to think about. But then we've also had things like Krista Siegfried's same-sex kiss in 2013, if I'm recalling correctly, where that was actually a direct political statement about gender and sexuality rights, specifically in Finland, but then I think it had a broader appeal for the rest of Europe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is there also this kind of situation where there's a kind of the East-West divide? I mean, where also there's the idea that there's kind of this self-perceived, sometimes kind of moral superiority of West, kind of as a progressive space, denouncing the East as being kind of homophobic. And do we also find that motif in this context?
Definitely. I think that one of the things that has been illustrated in recent years is that even though within Europe as it's defined by the EBU and Europe as it's defined by all those other organisations that are more political, economic organisations, even though that's gotten really quite big and it encompasses a lot of different nation states, there are still some really quite significant cultural and ideological differences. And certainly, I don't want to generalise too much, but certainly we could say that there is a trend for towards the centre and east of Europe is perhaps known as being a little bit more conservative, whereas the West has that reputation of being a little bit more progressive. Now, that can be quite a false divide, as each nation has its own sort of culture that goes along with it. But certainly I think that with some performances recently, the ideological differences between so-called East and West have come to the forefront again. And certainly I would say that with Russia announcing last year that it wanted to revive the Eurovision Song Contest, that kind of, and that was in direct response to Conchita Wurst's victory, that really illustrates how gender politics and sexual politics are a part of that boundary between the East and the West.
You're also talking in a certain way in your article about how, the Eurovision Song Contest is supposed to be non-political, right? There's this kind of very strong emphasis on the rules which say songs can't make political statements and so on. But there's an apparent conflict there with, in fact, and you're mentioning several examples of actually performances which are quite political in a certain way. So how does that, how do these two seeming contrasts work together or clash?
I think it comes down to the way that we define what is political. I think that when you look at what the EBU is thinking in terms of politics, they're thinking about making some sort of political comment about a nation state or about sort of bigger regional politics and things like that. So those sorts of lyrics and performances tend to be criticised in the official rules a little bit more thoroughly. So the good example for that is Ukraine and their song that was the anthem of the Orange Revolution, and that they were criticised for that and were asked to change some of the lyrics. But if we think about politics in that broader sense, then there's a lot more wiggle room in there, so that if there's actually a lot more room to make commentary about sexual politics and other kinds of social and cultural politics that aren't necessarily about nations and states, but are more about particular ideas that are in circulation. So that's where the sort of political idea comes through, even though a lot of people, I think, still manage to slip through in terms of some political lyrics.
I mean, you're looking at then also the response to this kind of emphasis on challenging gender roles in Russia in particular, but also in other countries. And what is the critique, or how does that come out? And I mean, you're discussing also, for example, the kind of pseudo lesbian performance of Tattoo in Russia years ago. So that was acceptable, but it wasn't. Or there's a critique of the kind of Conchita Wurst, of course, and other performances which are more playing with gender conventions.
I think it can come down to the authenticity, we could say, of that gendered performance. With Tattoo, there was such a constructed and contrived pop act where part of the deal with Tattoo was it was a bit of a joke. It was an open joke amongst Russian audiences, and eventually a little bit through to the West as well, that they weren't a real couple, that there was no real romance or sexual contact in any sort of meaningful way between those girls. It was just, this is what you want and we are giving it to you. Whereas when you look at what we could sort of say the more genuine or authentic gendered performances, they are challenging because they are actually taking quite seriously the gender politics that are involved. It's not, there is a playfulness, I would say, in somebody like Conchita Wurst. I think she's really quite an extraordinary icon, but she is also incredibly political. I mean, since her victory, she's been quite an important figure in not just performing at gay pride festivals and things like that, but she's even performed at European Parliament and the UN, and has become that gay and lesbian icon in the sense of promoting those ideas and those rights. So I think in terms of the intent of the performance, it's really quite different.
Yeah, you're also discussing a lot the case of Azerbaijan in your article. And I mean, there's an interesting contrast, right, between a country which certainly has not a very liberal view of, well, human rights as well as LGBT rights, but at the same time puts a lot of emphasis on participating in the Eurovision Song Contest. I mean, when it hosted it, but also every year investing heavily into buying the best, or whatever, the most promising, usually Scandinavian producers and writers. So how does that work together, or how do these two kind of dimensions come into conflict with one another?
I think that with some of the nations, and perhaps Azerbaijan is an example of it, I would say Russia is even a very good example of it, there's almost a pragmatism in how they approach winning and creating the best possible entry. And within that, there's a sort of acknowledgement that you do have to play towards a particular audience. So when we think about Eurovision, it's got such a huge queer audience that these are the voting members, perhaps more so than a lot of other subcultures and communities around Europe, and certainly here in Australia. Now that we can vote this year, which is a bit exciting for us. So there's one scholar, I think it was Julie Cassidy, and I found her ideas really quite interesting, where she argued that you can actually construct a particular performance around this sort of gay trajectory to say that you're playing towards a particular kind of voter, and if you win that vote, then you win Eurovision. So I think it's a pragmatic and strategic approach to winning. And also in terms of their politics as well, they know, Azerbaijan knows what is necessary to belong to those official European political and economic bodies, and so they have adjusted laws and policies accordingly. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a more in-depth change. Hopefully there is, but it doesn't necessarily signify that.
Of course. I mean, I wonder, I guess, if the exposure, showing in public television something like the Eurovision Song Contest has a subversive dimension in a place like Azerbaijan, where first of all voting matters, right? Unlike in elections, and I guess where you see, bearded drag queens, which is probably not something which is a common sight or anything conceptually common in a place like Azerbaijan or Russia, for that matter.
Yeah. Well, I think there is something really quite important in that idea of accessing particular cultural images, and I would say for the queer community of Azerbaijan, seeing something of themselves either on the stage or in the audience, and people that they can identify with, that there is probably a lot of meaning in that. But also through hosting it, for example, the contact between Azerbaijanis and the visitors who were going there for Eurovision, that was also a meaningful contact between them, and that hopefully there was some sort of stirring that emerges out that, some sort of greater understanding.
Great. Well, Jess, thank you so much for talking to us, and I guess, Australia, welcome to Eurovision is what I would conclude with.
We're very excited here.
Okay, thanks a lot.
No worries, thank you.